All right, I'm back for a little bit. I can only read for a little bit longer, then I gotta get to it. So, see how far I can get. Ultimatums from Austria and Italy jointly, October 1913, forced Serbia and Greece to evacuate Albania and made it possible to organize that country within frontiers agreeable to the Conference of Ambassadors at London. This episode hardly had time to develop into a crisis when it was eclipsed by the Liam von Sanders affair. Lehman von Sanders was the head of a German military mission invited to the Ottoman Empire to reorganize the Turkish army, an obvious necessity in view of its record in the Balkan Wars. When it became clear that Lehman was to be actual commander of the 1st Army Corps at Constantinople and practically chief of staff in Turkey, Russia and France protested violently. The crisis subsided in January 1914 when Lehman gave up his command at Constantinople to become Inspector General of the Turkish army. The series of crises from April 1911 to January 1914 had been almost uninterrupted. The spring of 1914, on the contrary, was a period of relative peace and calm, on the surface at least. But appearances were misleading. Beneath the surface, each power was working to consolidate its own strength and its links with its allies in order to ensure that it would have better, or at least no worse, success in the next crises, which everyone knew was bound to come. And it did, and come it did, with shattering suddenness, when the heir to the Habsburg throne, Archduke Francis Ferdinand, was assassinated by Serb extremists in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo on the 28th of June, 1914. That's so funny. My one friend that was Italian, he would always brag. Apparently, he was related to Archduke Ferdinand in some way. He was like, yeah, my family started World War One. like that's something to brag about. That was funny though. There followed a terrible month of fear, indecision, and hysteria before the World War was begun by an Austrian attack on Serbia on July 28, 1914. Whole volumes have been written on the crisis of July 1914, and it is hardly to be expected that the story could be told in a few paragraphs. The facts themselves are woven into a tangled skein, which historians have now unraveled. But more important than the facts, and considerably more elusive, are the psychological conditions surrounding these facts. The atmosphere of nervous exhaustion after 10 years of crises, the physical exhaustion from sleepless nights, the alternating moods of patriotic pride and cold fear, the underlying feeling of horror that the 19th century optimism and progress were leading to such a disaster, the brief moments of impatient rage at the enemy for starting the whole thing, the nervous determination to avoid war if possible, but not to be caught off guard when it came, and, if possible, to catch your opponent off guard instead. And finally, the deep conviction that the whole experience was only a nightmare and that at the last moment some power would stop it. These were the sentiments which surged to and fro in the minds of millions of Europeans in those 5 long weeks of mounting tension. A number of forces made the crises of the period before the outbreak of war more dangerous than they would have been a generation or so earlier. Among these, we should mention the influence of mass army, the influence of the alliance system, the influence of democracy, the effort to obtain diplomatic ends by intimidation, the mood of desperation among politicians, and lastly, the increasing influence of imperialism. The influence of the mass army will be discussed more extensively in the next chapter. Briefly, the mass army in a period in which communication was generally by telegraph and travel was by rail, was an unwielding thing which could be handled only in a rather rigid and inflexible fashion. As worked out by the Germans and used with such success in 1866 and 1870, this fashion required the creation, long before the war began, of detailed plans executed in sequence from an original signal and organized in such a way that every single person had his fixed role like a part in a great and intricate machine. As used by the Germans in early wars, extended by them and copied by others in the period before 1914, each soldier began to move from his home at a given signal. As they advanced, hour by hour and day by day, these men assembled their equipment and organized into larger and larger groups. At first, in platoons, companies, and regiments, then in divisions and armies. As they assembled, they were advancing along lines of strategic attack made long before, and, as likely as not, the convergence into armies would not be accomplished until the advance had already penetrated deep into enemy territory. As formulated in theory, the final assembly into a complete fighting machine would take place only a brief period before the whole mass hurled itself on an, as yet, only partially assembled enemy force. The great drawback to this plan of mobilization was its inflexibility and its complexity, these two qualities being so preponderant that once the original signal was given, it was almost impossible to stop the forward thrust of the whole assemblage anywhere short of its decisive impact on the enemy forces in their own country. This meant that in order to mobilize was almost equivalent to a declaration of war, that no country could allow its opponent to give the original signal much before it gave its own signal, and that the decisions of politicians were necessarily subordinate to the decisions of generals. So basically, it was kind of like mutually assured destruction even back then. So like once we unleash this killing machine, we can't stop it. The alliance system worsened this situation in two ways. On the one hand, it meant that every local dispute was potentially a world war, because the signal to mobilize given anywhere in Europe would start the machines of war everywhere. On the other hand, it encouraged extremism, because a country with allies would be bolder than a country with no allies, and because allies in the long run did not act to restrain one another, either because they feared that lukewarm support to an ally in his dispute would lead to even cooler support from an ally in one's own dispute later, or because a restraining influence in an earlier dispute so weakened an alliance that it was necessary to give unrestrained support in a later dispute in order to save the alliance for the future. There can be little doubt that Russia gave excessive support to Serbia in a bad dispute in 1914 to compensate for the fact that she had let Serbia down in the Albanian disputes of 1913. Moreover, Germany gave Austria a larger degree of support in 1914, although lacking sympathy with the issue itself, to compensate for the restraint which Germany had exercised on Austria during the Balkan Wars. The influence of democracy served to increase the tensions of crisis because elected politicians felt it necessary to pander to the most irrational and crass motivations of the electorate in order to ensure future elections, and did this by playing on hatred and fear of powerful neighbors or on such appealing issues as territorial expansion, nationalistic pride, a place in the sun, outlets to the sea, and other real or imagined benefits. At the same time, the popular newspaper press, in order to sell papers, played on the same motives and issues, arousing their peoples, driving their own politicians to extremes, and alarming neighboring states to the point where they hurried to adopt similar kinds of actions in the name of self-defense. Moreover, democracy made it impossible to examine international disputes on their merits, but instead transformed every petty argument into an affair of honor and national prestige, so that no dispute could be examined on its merits or settled as a simple compromise, because such a sensible approach would at once be hailed by one's democratic opposition as a loss of face and an unseemly compromise of exalted moral principles. The success of Bismarck's policy of blood and iron tended to justify the use of force and intimidation in international affairs and to distort the role of diplomacy so that the old type of diplomacy began to disappear. Instead of a discussion between gentlemen to find a workable solution, diplomacy became an effort to show the opposition how strong one was in order to deter him from taking advantage of one's obvious weakness. Metternich's old definition that a diplomat was a man who never permitted himself the pleasure of a triumph became lost completely, although it was not until after 1930 that diplomacy became the practice of polishing one's guns in the presence of the enemy. The mood of desperation among politicians served to make international crises more acute in the period after 1904. This depression came from most of the factors that we have already discussed, especially the pressure of the mass army and the pressure of the newspaper-reading electorate. But it was intensified by a number of other influences. Among these was the belief that war was inevitable. When an important politician, as, for example, Poincaré, decided that war is inevitable, he acts as if it were inevitable, and this makes it inevitable. Another kind of desperation closely related to this is the feeling that war is now preferable to war later, that war now is preferable to war later, since time is on the side of the enemy. Frenchmen dreaming of the recovery of Alsace and Lorraine looked at the growing power and population of Germany and felt that the war would be better in 1914 than later. Germans dreaming of a place in the sun or fearing an Entente encirclement looked at the Russian rearmament program and decided that they would have more hope of victory in 1914 than in 1917, when that rearmament program would be completed. Austria, as a dynastic state, had her own kind of desperation based on the belief that nationalistic agitation by the Slavs doomed her anyway if she did nothing, and that it would be better to die fighting than to disintegrate in peace. All right, got a couple more pages to the end of this section. 1914, more accurate than those of an earlier period. This is the subject which has given rise to much controversy since 1914 and has its crudest form been presented as the theory that the war was the result of machinations of international bankers or of the international armaments merchants, or was an inevitable result of the fact that European capitalist economic system had reached maturity. All of these theories will be examined in another place where it will be shown that they are, at worst, untrue or at best, incomplete. However, one fact seems to be beyond dispute. This is the fact that international economic competition was, in the period before 1914, requiring increasing political support. British gold and diamond miners in South Africa, German railroad builders in the Near East, French tin miners in the Southwest Pacific, American oil prospectors in Mexico, British oil prospectors in the Near East, even Serbian pork merchants in the Habsburg domains sought and expected to get political support from their home governments. It may be that things were always thus, but before 1914, the number of such foreign entrepreneurs was greater than ever, their demands more urgent, their own politicians more attentive, with the result that international relations were exasperated. Sorry. It was an atmosphere such as this that Vienna received news of the assassination of the heir to the Habsburg throne on June 28, 1914. The Austrians were convinced of the complicity of the Serbian government, although they had no real proof. We now know that high officials of the Serbian government knew of the plot and did little to prevent it. This lack of activity was not caused by the fact that Francis Ferdinand was unfriendly to the Slavs within the Habsburg Empire, but, on the contrary, by the fact that he was associated with plans to appease these Slavs by concession towards political autonomy within the Habsburg domains, and had even considered a project for changing the dual monarchy of Austrian and Hungarian into a triple monarchy of Austrian, Hungarian, and Slav. This project was feared by the Serbs because, by preventing the disintegration of Austria-Hungary, it would force postponement of their dream of making Serbia the Prussia of the Balkans. The project was also regarded with distaste by the Hungarians, who had no desire for that demotion associated with a shift from being one of two to being one of three joint rulers. Within the Habsburg cabinet, there was considerable doubt as to what action to take towards Serbia. Hungary was reluctant to go to war for fear that a victory might lead to the annexation of more Serbs, thus accentuating the Slav problem within the empire and making the establishment of a triple monarchy more unlikely. Ultimately, they were reassured by the promise that no more Slavs would be annexed and that Serbia itself would, after its defeat, be compelled to stop its encouragement of Slav nationalist agitation within the empire and could, if necessary, be weakened by transfer of part of its territory to Bulgaria. On this irresponsible basis, Austria, having received a promise of support from Germany, sent 48-hour ultimatum to Belgrade. This document, delivered on July 23rd, was far-reaching. It bound Serbia to suppress anti-Habsburg publications, societies, and teachings, to remove from Serbian official positions persons to be named later by Austria, to allow Habsburg officials to cooperate with the Serbs inside Serbia in apprehending and trying those implicated in the Sarajevo plot, and to offer explanations of various anti-Austrian utterances by Serbian officials. Serbia, confident of Russian support, answered in a reply which was partly favorable, partly evasive, and in one particular at least use of Austrian judges on Serbian tribunals, negative. Why did they put parentheses there? Okay. Serbia, confident of Russian support, answered in a reply which was partly favorable, partly evasive, and in one particular at least negative. The use of Austrian judges in Serbia was negative. Serbia mobilized before making her reply. Austria mobilized against her as soon as it was received and, on July 28th, declared war. The Russian Tsar, under severe pressure from his generals, issued, retracted, modified, and reissued an order for general mobilization. Since the German military timetable for the two-front war provided that France must be defeated before Russian mobilization was completed, France and Germany both ordered mobilization on August 1st, and Germany declared war on Russia. As the German armies began to pour westward, Germany declared war on France August 3rd and Belgium August 4th. Britain could not allow France to be defeated and in addition was morally entangled by the military conversation of 1906 to 1914 and by the naval agreement of 1912. Moreover, the German challenge on the high seas, in commercial activities throughout the world, and in colonial activities in Africa could not go unanswered. On August 4th, Britain declared war on Germany, emphasizing the inquiry of her attack on Belgium, although in the cabinet meeting of July 29th, it had been agreed that such an attack would not legally obligate Britain to go to war. Although this issue was spread among the people, the endless discussion ensued about Britain's obligation to defend Belgian neutrality under the Treaty of 1839. Those who made the decision saw clearly that the real reason for the war was that Britain could not allow Germany to defeat France. Okay, so the next section is going to be military history, 1914 to 1918. And I'm on page 225. There's a link to the PDF in the description. I will be back later with some other different videos, hopefully. Thanks for watching. If you did, I'll be back later. Peace.